Good morning. Good morning. My name is Trista Bishop Watt. I am the Director of Government Relations for Good Reason Houston, and I am so excited to have everybody here this morning. Today, we are going to dive into the Texas legislative session that is right around the corner. And I'm looking forward to sharing a little bit with y'all about how we're looking at the session, what we see for our Houston area kiddos, and what we're looking to prioritize as January starts. All right, so legislative session is going to start in mid-January. Texas operates on a biennial system, so every 2 years we have a legislative session, which means that we pack a lot into each of our sessions, and that means a lot for public education and for our kiddos here in the Houston area. So thank you all for taking the time to join us this morning and learn a little bit more about what we're hoping for the session and what we're seeing for our kids. Overall, Good Reason Houston is committed to making sure that Houston is the national leader in education, and we believe that this is entirely possible. And we work to connect the dots to improve public education. And what this really looks like is we want to make sure that we're bringing together parents, lawmakers, district leaders, educators, community partners, all together so that we can work together and make Houston the educational leader. And the way that we do this is by advising school districts on best practices, advocating for effective policies, and building awareness through community engagement through some of those student-focused, research-backed policies that we know are going to improve our kids' lives. Ultimately, we just want to make sure that every kid has an opportunity to live a successful life after they graduate high school and be able to make effective choices about their future. Today, we're really going to hone in on the advocacy portion of our approach and look at where we are today as the Houston region, what our legislative priorities are as Good Reason Houston based upon that data, and what we're really expecting from the legislative session based on what we've heard over the interim and what we're seeing already. So before we really dive into legislative policy, I want to take a moment for us to really ground in where we are today as a city and what the educational landscape looks like for the Houston region. And the way that we look at it here at Good Reason Houston is really from classroom to career. So we want to make sure that all of our kids, all the way from pre-K to employment, have an opportunity to maximize their earnings, unlock their career potential, and ultimately strengthen our workforce as the Houston region. So each of those steps in the process is very critical. And so we're going to look a little bit closer at data related to this classroom to career continuum to really ground in how our region is doing for our kids. So by the Houston region, what I'm talking about is our specific service area, and we cover 11 different traditional ISDs in the Houston area, as well as any of the charter organizations that are also public schools within our region. So that includes 7 large charter operators plus a few smaller charter operators throughout the region. But this is really what we're looking at in terms of Houston as far as our footprint is concerned. So this is a lot of kiddos. That's 689,000 kids that are enrolled in public schools in our area. And if you look at our chart here, you can see that breakdown by different student demographics to really understand what that means for our very diverse region. So we have a lot of kids that we have to meet needs for and a lot of diverse learning needs just within our urban core of Houston. So looking first to our youngest learners, starting in pre-K. Pre-K is a really critical time in a child's development. because pre-K sets the stage to be ready for kindergarten and ready for learning throughout a child's educational career. So our data team here at Good Reason Houston has dug into this information for us and are able to see that students that attend pre-K, that are eligible for pre-K and attend pre-K in the Houston area are over 2 times as likely to be ready for kindergarten moving into grade school. So pre-K plays a vital role in making sure our students are set up for success at the very beginning of their educational journey. And so students who are eligible for pre-K are disproportionately students who are higher need. Students are able to attend free public pre-K if they are economically disadvantaged or emergent bilingual. And there are a couple of other categories that are included, like children of peace officers and other first responders. But really, we hone in on our economically disadvantaged and our emergent bilingual students because we have very high populations of both in the Houston area. And what we see is that those populations disproportionately benefit from pre-K. Unfortunately, in Houston, our pre-K enrollment sits at about 39% of the eligible students that could be attending pre-K actually attending pre-K programs here. So that is a little bit below where we were prior to the pandemic, and we're starting to rebound a little bit, but still haven't gotten to pre-pandemic levels. And even then, we still hadn't broken 50%. So we really see that there is a great opportunity for more students to be enrolled in pre-K and take advantage of that program that is able to boost their learning before they enter kindergarten and close some of those achievement gaps that we see from the very beginning in education. So normally we would talk about our school quality across the region as part of our snapshot measures to help people understand how our schools are doing collectively at a higher level. There's a little bit of a hurdle though this time around with the A through F accountability system. So this is the academic accountability system that was implemented by the state in 2018. And that's our state system for setting academic standards and evaluating school districts based on those standards. Unfortunately, the A through F system, since it has been implemented, we've only had one full release of A through F accountability ratings, and this is due to a number of different factors. We had a transition period after the system was first implemented in 2018, and then we had 1 year of full accountability ratings in 2019 before COVID-19 hit, and those ratings were put on pause, rightfully so because of the pandemic. And now, unfortunately, for the last 2 years, the A through F accountability system has been the subject of litigation between school districts and the Texas Education Agency, which has delayed the public release of those ratings. So there are currently injunctions in place that are preventing the 2023 and 2024 A through F accountability ratings from being released. And what this means is we don't have that specific tool for being able to showcase how our schools are doing in the area. This unfortunately means that, parents and policymakers and even our districts don't have a good point of comparison for how our districts and our campuses are doing compared to other districts and campuses in the region and across the state. So while the A through F accountability system is still currently being delayed in the subject of litigation, we turn to other indicators of student achievement to really say how our schools are doing and how well they're meeting our students' needs. So looking at student achievement for our state STAR results, these are for students that are meeting or exceeding grade level standards across all subjects. But what we're seeing here for math and reading is that only 49% of students, I'm sorry, I said across all subjects, I meant across all grades, only 49% of students are meeting grade level standards. And unfortunately for math, that's even further behind. Only 39% of students are meeting grade level standards in math. This means that over half of our kids in the Houston region are not on grade level in core subjects. And again, for math, what you can see is that we did have a decline in both subjects during the COVID-19 pandemic, and reading has rebounded a little bit, and we're starting to plateau around that 49%. But math still hasn't reached pre-pandemic levels and has started to flatten out at the same time. What this means for our kids is that we have a lot more to do to make sure that kids are able to grasp those foundational math concepts so that they're able to meet grade level standards and ultimately be set up for post-secondary success. Turning a little bit to our educators in the Houston region. So normally our educator pipeline is not necessarily one of our snapshot measures that we include as an organization, but it is an analysis that we do every year. So this is data from last year, but our teacher turnover rate in the Houston region is at an all-time high for all of our districts, and this is since 2018. So you can see those are all of our individual traditional ISDs that are part of our service area. And the gray is 2018 compared to the teal color, which is 2023. And for almost all of our districts, we're seeing teacher turnover at a much higher rate than we did in 2018. And this has to do with a lot of different factors that determine how our teachers are choosing to stay in the profession and not the subject of this particular data. But I think that it's clear that we are experiencing a very different landscape for our educator pipeline that we did pre-pandemic. And so that's something that we want to be cognizant of, especially as we're moving into the legislative session, and there are opportunities for policy to support our teachers and support a more robust pipeline for highly effective educators in our region. And ultimately, what we look at is how are our schools preparing our students for post-secondary success? And there's a real challenge that we face as a region. So with 88% of our students graduating high school, what we're seeing is that about 74% are considered college, career, or military ready based on our state standards of academic accountability. Unfortunately, even with 74% that are considered college or career ready, only about 47% of our students actually enroll in a post-secondary institution within 2 years of graduating high school. So we get a drop off there, and it drops off further because only 27% of our students actually complete a post-secondary credential within 6 years of graduating high school. So less than a third of our graduates in the Houston region are actually getting a post-secondary credential. And post-secondary credentials are very tied to a living wage in our area. So of the 27% that complete a post-secondary credential, only 20% of those are actually attaining a living wage. So when we look at this chart, what we're really seeing is that are, even though we are graduating a high number of students in the Houston region, they are not actually effectively prepared for college or career in a way that leads to a high wage job that can sustain them or their family. And this is not good for our graduates, and this is certainly not good for our local economy either. We want to make sure that when kids graduate for high school, they have the skills and the opportunities necessary to live successful lives and choice-filled lives. So all of this data is based on some analysis that we conduct each and every year. Most of these are released, are based on the Texas Academic Performance Reports, which are released usually around January in the new year, which means we will be updating a lot of this data as the release from the Texas Education Agency comes out. So please stay tuned with Good Reason Houston because we will be sharing that out as the data become available. But I'll also flag that for most of our post-secondary readiness data, there's a little bit of a lag because, again, we're looking at students that are completing post-secondary credentials within 6 years. However, we're engaged in a pretty exciting long-term post-secondary readiness project. And so the first phase of that research is already out and available on our website. And that's something that we will share with y'all as we follow up from this presentation. But ultimately, what the data show are the situation that we're facing in the Houston region. Ultimately, less than half of our students are reading and performing math at grade level, and that's reflected in the post-secondary outcomes that we're seeing for our kids. We believe, as Good Reason Houston, that Houston students deserve better. And we think that there are opportunities this legislative session to provide better for our students. So now that we've grounded in the data and where we are as a city and what this means for our kids and for our education landscape, let's dive into the legislative session and talk a little bit more about the levers that we think will make Houston a better place for education for our kids. So with the 89th Texas legislative session, we want to prioritize just a few things that we think are really high impact areas to be able to support education. One, strategically invest in funding streams that support public education. Two, retain a fair, rigorous, and transparent academic assessment and accountability system. Three, build strong foundations with high quality early learning. Four, strengthen our pipeline for effective educators. And five, drive outcomes aligned post-secondary readiness in public education. So we're going to dive into each of these specific priorities and talk a little bit more about how the legislature can better support our kids and better prepare our kids for post-secondary life. Looking at funding. So if y'all have been following the news over the last couple of years, you know that our public schools are facing some pretty significant budget shortfalls. We have districts in our region that have had to cut significant numbers of staff. We've had districts that have had to close campuses. So a lot of our school districts are facing a very interesting funding cliff because the federal pandemic relief funds that they were receiving to support learning loss during the pandemic have ended, and our school districts are having to grapple with less funds than they previously had to be able to support programmings. Meanwhile, our learning loss, especially in math, hasn't completely rebounded to pre-pandemic levels. So we believe that this is a great opportunity with the legislature to strategically invest in funding streams that support public education. So we want to ensure that public school systems have the financial resources they need to meet student learning needs and drive post-secondary success. That's strategically investing in some data-backed student-focused reforms that were originally introduced a few legislative sessions ago by House Bill 3. That are designed to improve student outcomes. And we'll talk a little bit about what those data-backed student-focused reforms were. So in addition to considering an increase in the basic allotment, and the basic allotment is the general funding formula per student that districts receive to educate our kids. We also recommend targeted investments in these research-backed allotments. So one of them is the early education allotment. The state has allotment that specifically focuses on programming in grades pre-K through third grade. So this allotment can only be used to support learning in pre-K through third grade. Unfortunately, the way that the allotment is currently set up, students that are in kinder through third grade generate funding for districts under the allotment, but pre-K students do not. So if we want to invest in pre-K, try to be able to improve some of those enrollment numbers that I showed you before and the quality of our pre-K programs, incentivize districts to bring more kids into pre-K to set them up for early success, we can invest in the early education allotment to make sure that pre-K students are generating funding under that allotment. Additionally, we have a teacher incentive allotment that was introduced by House Bill 3 back in the 86th session. And what this does is provide districts with additional funding that is directly for teacher compensation for highly effective educators. So for teachers that are designated under the teacher incentive allotment, the district receives additional funding, and 90% of those funds have to be used to compensate teachers on the campus where the teacher earned designation. So this means that this is significant funding that goes directly to teacher compensation and for our most highly effective educators that we want to make sure we're retaining in the profession. So investing in our teachers by increasing the number of effective educators statewide that qualify for additional compensation. This means expanding that allotment so that more teachers can take advantage of it. Additionally, the compensatory education allotment is an allotment that was created to make sure that our highest need students receive the support that they need in order to meet their learning needs. And so by adjusting some of the measures in the compensatory allotment, we can invest in those high need students to support high impact interventions and tutoring. So just by revisiting those little formula weights again to make sure that our students that have the highest need are able to have the type of interventions that they need to support their learning. So in terms of funding, we think that these are areas that we know, based on research, are more likely to provide a better impact for our students, right? Starting early, where we know our students need those foundations and in order to build off of in their learning career. Investing in our educators, investing in our students that need more support. And as an organization we've supported significantly, especially with the teacher incentive allotment throughout the region. And actually 6 of our Houston area districts have been fully approved for the teacher incentive allotment, and 5 more are in the process for approval. So what this means is if that allotment were to expand, we would actually have a lot of districts that are already able to take advantage of those funds and more right along the way. Next up, we want to make sure that as a state, we're retaining a fair, rigorous, and transparent academic assessment and accountability system. So I talked a little bit about the current situation where we have only had a full A through F rating once since 2018 because of various issues like transition, like the COVID-19 pandemic, and right now litigation that has caused a little bit of ambiguity in our A through F accountability system. So we support clarifying the A through F accountability system to ensure students, families, and communities have access to a robust and transparent academic accountability system that measures student academic success, public school quality, and illuminates where we need to target resources. So essentially, we just want to make sure that both our school districts and the Texas Education Agency have clarity over expectations from the accountability system so that those ratings can be released on a consistent, transparent basis, and so that the public has an opportunity to see how our students are doing, and more importantly, see areas that are doing well that we can emulate and areas that need additional support and resources so that we can advocate for those resources. On the assessment side of things, the state of Texas has been piloting the Texas Through-Year Assessment Pilot. And what this is a through-year assessment that is able to provide teachers with actionable data throughout the school year and students opportunities to take the same test throughout the year to be able to gauge their progress over time. Many of our school districts use different types of interim assessments to accomplish this, but this is really piloting a statewide system for what that looks like. TTAP is currently in its 3rd year of pilot, and we've already seen some promising results from the 1st year report that TEA put out in August. So we want to make sure that we're continuing to invest in the implementation and ongoing review of these findings from the program to ensure that the state remains committed to continuous improvement in our assessment and accountability system. Next, we're really looking at early learning and building strong foundations with high quality early learning. We want to increase the resources for high quality early education programs and incentivize the use of research-backed classroom tools that are designed to promote effective, engaging interactions and environments foundational to early learning. So in addition to expanding the early education allotment, which I already covered a little bit earlier, there are other ways that the legislature can support high quality instruction before students reach that critical juncture of third grade. So what we're really talking about here are pre-K through second grade and how we can make sure that our students have the support that they need before they actually enter third grade, where it's a tested grade and we're able to see how students are doing. Unfortunately, in our early grades, we don't have as much information to be able to really see how our kiddos are doing. So the two areas that we really are looking at here are literacy and math. Again, going back to the data that I shared earlier, only 49% of our students are meeting our reading state standards. So we want to make sure that we're continuing to refine and support early literacy so that students have the foundation necessary to be on grade level by third grade. And what this looks like is defining high quality literacy screeners and ensuring students who are not meeting grade level receive appropriate instructional support before they reach third grade. Last legislative session, there was a bill proposed, HB 2162, by one of our Houston area representatives, Harold Dutton, who introduced a bill that would have provided this support for students to make sure that we are focusing on those literacy skills early on. And this is building on a lot of work that the legislature has already done to support the science of reading across the state through reading academies to train our educators on the science of reading to support those early literacy skills. So this is really just making sure that for our districts who are already using screeners in those grades, that they have a good definition of what high quality looks like, and pairing that with appropriate support for students who are demonstrably not meeting grade level already in those areas. So math is a little bit different in that as a state, we haven't had the same level of investment in math support even early on. So building a strong foundation in math really looks at like developing a corollary support for early numeracy to set students up for success. We have had math academies as a state, but they weren't required in the same way that reading academies were. So really looking at how to make sure that we're meeting those numeracy needs early on and preparing students to take advantage of advanced coursework. Last legislative session, the legislature did pass SB 2124, which is an incredible bill to make sure that more students are able to take advantage of advanced math coursework in middle school, but students have to be meeting grade level in order to take advantage of that advanced coursework. So it's very important for us to make sure that students have that foundation early on in their educational career so that they are able to take that advanced coursework. And advanced coursework is specifically associated with better post-secondary outcomes for students. There's a whole host of research that shows that students that are able to take Algebra 1 by 8th grade and take multiple advanced math courses in high school are more likely to enroll in and complete post-secondary education. So this is really an opportunity for us to build on the work that the legislature has already done to support math outcomes, but starting at an earlier grade. This is especially critical in math because, again, only 39% of our students in the Houston area are meeting math grade level standards. And because the way that math is taught, that is very sequential and adds on to itself, without those foundational skills in math, students fall further and further behind. So that's really an area of high impact for our legislature to focus on. Next, strengthening our pipeline for effective educators. We want to cultivate and retain a workforce of education professionals by incentivizing rigorous preparation pathways, recognizing and investing in highly effective educators, and supporting ongoing professional development. So To incentivize high quality educator preparation programs, what we're really looking at here is providing prospective educators with paid on the job training in a real classroom environment through rigorous pathways like teacher residencies and apprenticeships. The state has actually taken a large step in incentivizing and promoting teacher residencies by recognizing them as a separate certification. So this is an opportunity for the legislature to really put some support behind that and make sure that there's a lot of incentive for not only teacher residency programs to be offered, but also for prospective educators to take advantage of those programs. In addition to teacher turnover being at an all-time high in Houston, our area is actually seeing a decline in teacher experience and tenure. And what this means for the Houston area is that we're increasingly seeing first-year teachers in our classrooms. So a lot more of our classrooms have first-year educators that are teaching our students. And having rigorous pathways that give them that real classroom experience prior to having a classroom of kiddos of their own is really critical, especially at this juncture now with our educator pipeline the way that it is in the area. In addition to those preparation programs, the Texas convened the Texas Teacher Vacancy Task Force, and they put together a number of recommendations to support the recruitment and retention of effective educators. And so this is a task force of educators that are able to provide those recommendations for the profession. By implementing those recommendations, the legislature can support our teacher pipeline. And some of those include, again, expanding the teacher incentive allotment, which I've already mentioned, providing technical support to districts for strategic staffing models, and potentially implementing a teacher time study to understand how teachers are utilizing their time so that we can improve and make sure that they have more time to focus on instruction. So the Texas Teacher Vacancy Task Force recommendations are available online. There's a report through the Texas Education Agency website that we can share with y'all. But we believe that those are recommendations that are actionable now. And there were several bills last session that were introduced to support those task force recommendations. And we expect to see the same this time around. Lastly, we want to make sure that we are driving outcomes aligned post-secondary readiness. And to do that, we need to align our college, career, military readiness pathways with post-secondary outcomes. We want to set graduates up for post-secondary success by incentivizing robust college, career, and military readiness pathways in our pre-K through 12 programming that align with post-secondary opportunities in high-wage, high-demand industries. So once again, revisiting our chart from before to really drive home what this means. At the moment, the way that we're looking at college, career, and military readiness means that 74% of our graduates are considered college and career ready, but unfortunately, only 20% actually end up with a living wage job after 6 years after high school graduation. So that means that there is a gap between what we are considering college, career, and military ready and what is actually leading to better post-secondary outcomes for our students. So in order to close that gap, and make sure that students have access to programming that prepares them with the skills necessary in college and the opportunities for post-secondary attainment afterwards, we need to make sure that there is better alignment between our K through 12 pathways and the actual outcomes that we're seeing for students, and which industries and which jobs and which skills are necessary in order for students to actually achieve success after graduation. And once again, I'll plug our post-secondary research here. So we have extensive post-secondary research. It's available on our website, goodreasonhouston.org. And phase 1 of our research actually looks at the credential attainment portion of this compared to the living wage. And what we're seeing from our research is that getting a credential does matter and does lead to a better chance of attaining a living wage in the Houston area. So that means when we look at credentials, those are credentials that are achieved through a post-secondary institution. It includes not just bachelor's and associate's degrees, but also certificate 1 and 2s. So there are a lot of opportunities for our students, but unfortunately, we don't see as many students enrolling in those programs, completing those programs, and ultimately being able to have a self-sustaining wage. So now that we've kind of covered what our priorities are for the session and how it aligns with what we're seeing from our data in the Houston region and the needs of our students here, I want to talk a little bit more about what we're expecting from the legislative session. So there are a lot of factors that influence each legislative session, but I want to talk a little bit about things that are relatively unique to the session that we're heading into this time around in January. So first, the school choice conversation was left unfinished last session. So for those of you that aren't familiar with how the last session fared, um, there was a lack of consensus between the Texas House and the Senate during the regular session around education savings accounts and school choice. And that led to 2 additional special sessions, in addition to the 2 that happened for property tax relief, because there was also not consensus around that. But 2 additional special sessions later that year, where both the House and the Senate were still unable to come to an agreement around education savings accounts. And unfortunately, that conversation and the lack of consensus between the 2 chambers held up other education-focused legislation. And that included proposals that received a lot of bipartisan support for school funding and teacher compensation. So what this means moving into this legislative session is because that conversation was left unfinished, that lack of consensus between the House and the Senate remains. And as we're moving into the legislative session, we do anticipate that that conversation will continue and that there will continue to be a focus on school choice and education savings accounts. And historically, based on how it went last session, during the regular session and the additional special sessions, things like school funding have been very closely tied to the conversation around education savings accounts. So essentially, we anticipate that if there is not a sort of consensus between the 2 chambers about how they're going to handle education savings accounts one way or another, that we're going to face a lot of challenges with getting legislation, especially around school funding, passed. Next up, the Texas House speakership is uncertain. So our speaker in the Texas House is currently facing a pretty heated speaker race. So several representatives have indicated an intent to pursue the speakership. And what this really means for the legislative session is that with this uncertainty, one, it's difficult for offices to plan legislation and how things are going to move throughout the process, because a change in House leadership can mean a shift in priorities for the chamber and also a potential change up in committee composition. So every year, the leaders in each chamber select the chairman of committees and also who is going to be on each committee, including the House Public Education Committee. So if House leadership were to change, we might expect a more significant change up in the composition of our Public Education Committee, which could mean, again, as different legislators have different priorities for education, could mean a significant change in the way that the House is considering education-focused legislation. And finally here, one of the factors that I would specifically highlight for this legislative session is that the A through F litigation is still pending in courts. So I mentioned that our A through F accountability system is currently the subject of 2 separate lawsuits from districts, and those 2 lawsuits are currently delaying the release of A through F ratings. So both of those lawsuits are currently being considered by the 15th Court of Appeals. They are in different stages of litigation. For one of them, for our 2023 accountability ratings, they actually just had oral arguments not too long ago, and we could see a decision from the court at any point in time moving forward. It has been submitted to the court for their opinion. But until those lawsuits are resolved, we do not have accountability ratings for the 2023 or 2024, which means that this is a subject that is ripe for the legislature to consider how that statute might need to be clarified in order to support better understanding between our agency and also our school districts to ensure that we're able to receive consistent accountability ratings. So this is a topic that we know is likely going to be a topic of conversation moving into the legislative session. So with these factors, there are a few other things that can give us an indication of how the legislative session might go, including what the legislature has been actively preparing for. Between legislative sessions, each chamber issues interim committee charges. And these charges direct committees to consider and hear testimony on specific topics identified by House and Senate leadership. And so each committee has separate interim charges depending on how leadership is prioritizing things. And for the Senate Education Committee, some of the topics that I would highlight from their interim charges include early education. The Senate had a topic that was focused on early literacy and numeracy and heard testimony throughout the interim. Innovative testing reform, and really that is our Texas 3-year assessment pilot that I had previously highlighted. So the Senate Education Committee got an update from the commissioner on how the TTAP pilot was going, and from districts that were piloting the assessment to understand how it was going and some of the findings from the first year report. Later on, the lieutenant governor also issued an interim charge, an additional interim charge that focused on college pathways and ensuring that students were able to get credit for their advanced courses as they moved into the post-secondary space and applied to an institution of higher education. The Senate also had an interim charge for the Education Committee focused on funding oversight, specifically on how pandemic relief funds, the COVID-19 funds, we call them the ESSER funds, were spent by school districts. And this gives a good indication of how the Senate is thinking through school finance and some of the things that are factoring into the decision making about what might be allocated to school districts next session. I'll also note that the lieutenant governor, although there was not a specific interim charge on this, the lieutenant governor has been very clear about his continued prioritization of education savings accounts, which goes back to my last slide and the education savings account school choice conversation that is currently unfinished between the House and the Senate. So still indicating that that's going to be a large topic of conversation between the chambers. So looking over on the House side of things, we do see some overlap with the Senate priorities and the interim charges. So early education, early literacy, and numeracy was also a topic that was covered by the House in August in their interim committee hearings. Our own CEO, Carrie Wright, was able to be invited testimony for that particular charge and share a little bit about the Houston area and our post-secondary, apologies, our early education landscape here and how our early education needs factor into potential policy solutions. Additionally, the House had a specific interim charge around teacher workforce and really honing in on certification. We're also seeing a higher number of uncertified educators, and that's because of our pipeline issues. Again, teacher turnover is much higher. We're increasingly seeing first-year educators, and we're seeing more and more uncertified educators in our school districts in order to keep up with, the demand in our classrooms. So the House really dug into that with their interim charge. They also had a specific interim charge on school choice and education savings accounts. So again, indicating that both the House and the Senate are thinking through what education savings accounts in the future of that looks like. And for us in the public education space, that means that that conversation is going to continue to be a priority for both chambers, and a lot of other types of public education bills have been tied specifically to the conversation around education savings accounts. So we expect to see the reports from these interim charges from both committees in any day now. So in the next month or so, we'll get those interim reports, and that will continue to give us an indication of how the Texas Senate and House are thinking about each of these topics. But the fact that they have honed in on these topics for the committee charges means that these are topics that they're preparing for in the upcoming legislative session, and we do anticipate that there will be some prioritized bills in each chamber that focus on each of these issues. So with that, with an understanding of how the Houston area education landscapes is situated right now, and how what the needs of our kids in our public schools are, with our specific recommendations and policy priorities from Good Reason Houston, with a rundown of what we might expect, what topics we might expect to come up from the legislature. This is really an opportunity for all of us to band together as Houston, as a city, to make sure that our voices are heard and that the needs of our communities and our kids and our families are elevated, so that we can make Houston the national leader in education. Every legislative session is an opportunity for us to share our perspective from one of the most diverse cities in the world, and from some of the largest public school districts in our state. So we would certainly encourage everybody to consider what we've shared today, and to get involved and share these priorities with your representatives, with your legislators, and with your community, so that we're all elevating the needs of our public students across the region. Um, Before we go, and I'll check to see if we've gotten any questions from folks. But before we go, I want to highlight a couple of resources that are available from the legislature. What I didn't cover in this particular conversation was sort of how the legislative process works, and what dates of interest there are, so what we can expect when things are moving for the legislature. And there are a couple of resources here to be able to see, one, those important dates for the legislature. So when session is going to start, when bills will be filed by, when session ends, and that full legislative process of how a bill becomes a law in Texas, and the intricacies of our legislative process. And you can see in our webinar chat, we've shared those resources along with our post-secondary report and our website, so that you can go and check each of those things out. Again, I'll see if we've got any questions from the Q&A, but I do want to make sure that I also highlight that if you want to keep up with what's going on in the legislative session, if you want updates from us, especially around the topics that I highlighted as our priorities, you can sign up today for our newsletter, and we will be sure to share with you what's going on throughout the legislative session and keep you up to date on all things public education policy. So please feel free to scan our QR code or visit our website, goodreasonhouston.org, and be able to sign up to keep in touch. All right. Well, Thank you all so much for joining us today. I think we're finishing up a little bit early here, but we really appreciate your time and your interest in public education policy. Thank you so, so much, and we hope to see you engaged throughout the legislative session.